Hi, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. This is a review video and we are looking at Uhi's Batzilla. It's an odd name. It's actually German for bacillus, so it's somewhat like the plague. I assume that's his humorous take on referencing the virus synth, but maybe not. He made a couple of instruments which he referred to as Berlin, and I assume that's with regards to Germanic music styles, and particularly probably Berlin School, being Tangerine Dream as the major proponents of the Berlin School, as opposed to the other fellows who were cling-clanging around about the robots, to fields or sounds. And then, of course, there's the French School, which was Jarre. Exactly where Vangelis fitted in with that, I guess technically we might call him more French School, but he was doing his own thing. Now, Batzilla is an odd beast. It is a beast. Urs is very open about that, and he's obviously quite aware he's not going to sell as many of these as the broader synths like, say, Hive, the everything for everyone kind of thing. And that's in many ways a good thing, because he's built an instrument that's a little different in the market for people who are looking for something that's different. This is an incredibly digital synth. There are some decisions made which can allow it to be rounded out with a more slightly analogy flavour, but you can easily turn those off and make it a very hardcore digital synth, despite the fact that it has this wiring on the front that kind of gives you the impression of it being a modular Moog kind of a thing. First little point of order is with regards to some sense of pronunciation. These are German people using German words. We are, of course, English-ish people using anglicised versions of said. Now, Urs Heckmann, if we were to take Urs and try to pronounce just the U, or pronounce the two together, it becomes Uhi. And that kind of sounds like we've had too many lagers with our Vindaloo, and it's not really part of, well, now the King's English. So let's take another example. The wonderful German sort of cabaret jazz singer, Ute Lemper. That's spelled U-T-E. Literally in English, that word is ute. But if we call her a ute, we're actually making her an open-backed vehicle for tradesmen. I think she's a little more elegant than an open-backed vehicle for tradesmen. It's ute, or something similar-ish, in English, while still bearing, respect to the German. And therefore, it's quite consistent that Ute Lemper would be Uhi. Hence the logic. Cool. Moving forward, the synth opens up like this. And compared to a Hive or similar type synth, you might go, yeah, that's not very cool. It's a sine wave, dude. But that's the right choice in this situation, because this is a sound designer's digital paradise. Not a sound designer's paradise, but a sound designer's digital paradise. It's very focused. And in that sense, we want to start with a sine wave and say, where am I going today? Presets we will have a bit of a look at. You can access them from there, but you can also access them from here. There are quite a lot of them. And what's really nice is that largely they cover that this is a very digital synth. Seeing the engine is a combination of phase distortion, which is Casio CZ, with FM or phase modulation characteristics, so that's DX7, then hearing this sort of DX7 type sounds delivered really quite nicely. Again, I'm not going to compare them directly. How do they compare to a DX7? I don't think so. This is an instrument in its own right. But the CZ style stuff sits really, really nicely. So pretty big bank. I don't know how many sounds, but there's a pretty big bank. But I think most people who get this will be getting this for its abilities as a very, very digital sound engine. And that, I think, is its great strength. Now, when I got it, I went straight away to making a piece with it. I was already working on some album stuff under the name of Half Cubed, and this fitted in well. So let's have a look at these. Are not presets, these are made right from scratch, from sine wave building up to this. Yes, we start with elevator noise. Each of these tracks has an atmosphere and an environment inside it. We can get rid of that for now. How much movement there is in here, and then I've opened the automation for you to be able to see that as well. And we've got the next sound come in. It's quite simple, it's all just about adding a layer. Listen to what's happening here. Got like a little piano pulse in the background there. It's all the one sound, that's the top sound. And then a more sort of beautiful, stringy sort of sound. I very much wanted to go, okay, how is this going to feel compared to my memories of something like my Casio CZs? And I think it does a great job. And we can hear the automation changing how that sound speaks. And then we get to a lead sound at the end. More complex than the sound appears on the surface, but about creating movement within our existing thing. So we want this sound to appear quite simple against that very mobile background. Joy to use, easy to work out, didn't open the manual. I only opened the manual once in this, and that was to get my head around understanding something that was offered as this is supposedly a feature, but I couldn't work it out. I think some of the explanation or some of the usage of terms is not super clear, but it is one that you're going to need the manual for. Uhi, of course, is, well, he's one of the biggest names in the business. As I have mentioned recently, he seems to have been a little quieter, but he's been up to stuff, working on the clap format. And I see just a few days ago has released updates on the fact that Zebra 3 is still happening. Yeah, dude. I'm looking forward to that to see what he will bring with that. But while Batzilla has been around for some time, I haven't spent a lot of time with it until now, but I've always been intrigued by it because it strikes me as the kind of synth that you could really dig your teeth into and that I would really enjoy as being a unique character instrument, that I would make sounds that might be quite reminiscent of other existing sounds, but would not be just that sound. There are too many people who try to make pieces by getting, I want that perfect sound. I saw a job this morning where somebody was wanting all the preset sounds out of this newly released piece, and he wanted them all so that he could make essentially his piece that sounded exactly the same. And my advice was like, buddy, it's not going to work out for you, even if somebody gave you those exact presets. And I think you could probably just go get Nexus, because they sounded very like that. But it was the way that they were composed, and it was nice use of simple harmony, and the way they're automated and they're mixed that makes the, really pretty cool result. So Batzilla really is about people like myself who are very open, very interested in digital synths and about making their own sounds. And as you can see, he's really open about that right from the beginning. It's definitely a geek machine. Yes, it is. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing. With regards to pricing, well, as we see here, it was just as easy to do the screenshot with both. There were a pair of instruments with these cables. There's Ace, which is any cable everywhere, which in theory is that you can take any cable and plug it into anything else. It's more of an analogy style semi-modular, whereas this one with Batzilla, and I can't remember with Ace how true to his word the any cable everywhere is. With Batzilla, not quite so much. But it does create this fascinating workspace, this playground in which you can play with a lot of the concepts of hardcore digital synthesis and the beautiful things that come from it. But in all fairness, with all things digital, we often have to do a little bit more work to get it to what most people are looking for in terms of beautiful. We might as well run through the good and bad whilst we're at it. So what I think is really good is obviously it's a digital workspace. It's pretty unashamedly, not 110%, but it's pretty unashamedly, this is a digital synth. We're going to let you do digital synth stuff in here. And that's cool because there is so much emphasis on let's pretend everything's analogy. And that wears thin. We really should be allowed and encouraged to explore all the amazing things that are digital synths, because of course every VST is a digital synth. Just because we paint the word analog on the front in retro wave neon doesn't make it analog. It's all digital. But sound is sound is sound is sound is sound. A sine wave's a sine wave, a sawtooth is a sawtooth. And there are various things that we can do to munge it up in the middle, and it really doesn't matter whether it's done digitally, analogically. Digital gives us a huge amount of control and a far greater range of sounds. The fact that this gives you access to a fair amount of that in one box is really rather cool. The PD, the phase distortion, does sound pretty Casio CZ-y, and that of course pleases me, impresses me. There have been a few stabs at doing Casio CZ things, and often they just don't sound or feel right. This, while not being an emulation of a CZ at all, because there are certain technical differences, the fundamental oscillator, the PD form, feels quite Casio CZ, and that I think is a great thing, because there's some wonderful things about the Casio approach to what was essentially the same phase modulation as the DX7 from Yamaha. It's a nice thing, and it's nice to see that given a reasonable run here. The limits or concerns, and I don't think there's anything particularly bad in here, but it is of course a little scary. But if you're looking at this and going, oh, that's too scary, it's not for me, then it probably is not for you. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't use it, but if you come in thinking it's going to be a preset machine, then yeah, there are a pile of presets in there, but then you're really not making the most of what it's about. There are some choice limits, and it doesn't necessarily mean they can't be worked around. Every situation is going to bring some limits. If we have a keyboard that's 4 octaves, then what happened to the other keys? How do we get them? So that's where we have a transpose button. So some of that is just inevitable. But some of them I sort of feel like, couldn't we have done that a different way or been more open? But none of it's enough to say that it ruins the experience. And a lot of times with an instrument, it's about sort of going, I can't do that, but if I go around that way, and it's in how you do those things that you find the flavor or the character of the instrument. Like a Casio CZ has this funny cardboardy sound, especially if you had poorer converters or your converters were made on Friday or have been dropped out of a window. Somebody fell out of a window and kicked my CZ on the way through, and it was never quite the same, which made for a unique instrument. So just understand how that works. And in terms of the understanding how it works, while this instrument does a pretty darn good job of presenting itself on the surface, assuming you have a pretty good understanding of synthesis, if you've not really got much of that, then walking into this, you're probably just going to go, and there's that assumption right from the beginning from Urs that this is not necessarily aimed at you. If you want to start down this road, Ace is probably the better point to start in. But definitely RTFM. I went a long way, deliberately, without looking at the manual at all. But as I say, I did stop after I'd made most of my decisions and say, okay, how do I achieve this particular outcome they've said I can do, but I cannot for the life of me find? It was just through, well, different name. It's named one thing here and now another there. Now, technically, it probably makes perfect sense because Urs is always very logical in his own way, but it didn't see it. But it was there in the manual, and once it was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Oh, now it works. Definitely, if you're not prepared to RTFM, then just be prepared to be scared and probably struggle to make value of your investment. That's not a flaw in the synth, it's just an inevitability with this kind of a beast. Let's look at some of the features. First thing I will say is that this is so deep and so capable that I will not be trying to cover everything at all. I'm going to gloss to try to give you a sense of how to get your head around the instrument and some of the cool things that you can do. So if I don't cover this little widget, please don't write in and tell me that I don't know what I'm doing or any of that silly kind of stuff. Get on, make something cool about it. If you think that that feature is well worth having a great expose on, then make your own video on that feature, which will be a welcome addition to the canon of Batzilla-ness. First thing, this is sort of a funny one, but I keep encountering this with synths. It might or might not be a bad thing, but it's a thing you kind of got to learn to be aware of. We start playing this instrument. I've opened it up and turned it into a sawtooth, because that's sort of the common starting point. And blow me down if it doesn't sound all kinds of impressive, big and fat and rich. Okay. So if I compare that to Europa, oh, Europa just sounds pathetic. But when we compare them, I could write a high-energy disco hit with that. Doom, 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 doom. It's an octave apart. So the instrument is actually running minus 12 semitones. It's running an octave off. Now, of course, it's going to sound richer because it's an octave down, so we've got more conscious awareness of those overtones. Now, there's no rule, but now that's a fairer comparison. But we're still sort of thinking, hang on, so let's have a look at this. Minus 25, minus 16. Ooh, hello. There's a massive level difference between. So that, of course, sounds better because it's like it's bigger, it's richer, and all of these things. And again, it's not necessarily a wrong thing, but if we add 6 dB here, we're now sort of in the same ballpark. Stop! So the reason I raise this is nothing against Uhi in particular, but there's a lot of this in Dorville, of getting that immediate, like, wow, this is so much more amazing, commonly by presenting the instrument dropped an octave and at least 6 dB louder. Sometimes it's small, or a lot of little plugins, sound goodifiers, I've spoken about this with saturators and stuff like that, they merely add 2 dB. And as you A-B with the 2 dB, you go, oh, that's better. Makes it sound like there's all kinds of extra cool, simply because we've made things louder and more available. But I think it is pretty important to understand that if you're trying a synth, that you don't just get steamrolled or bowled over by that immediate, shall we say, discrepancy, in that we're not comparing apples and oranges. One of the first things that we will go into is the GUI. This is the default GUI. Looks nice. But one of the problems is that there's a whole pile of functionality that's put off on a second screen. Now, I understand that for certain users that's possibly a good thing, because they go, oh, well, it's less clutter, man. But my point of view, and obviously one that has been considered and resolved, is that when you're working in this kind of environment, you want everything available. You don't want to shuttle things off because either you forget they're there or you can't see them easily to grab them. So while the gear porn, horrible name, is not as pretty, and it is a little bit more it's actually far easier to work in, because once you get your head around what the components are, and you might find it easier to start with an original, but once you get your head around what the basic components are, when you go to reach for something that's not really here, at least to me, having to go to another window is a bit of a fail. But bear in mind, as a Reason user, one of the reasons I love it is that your synths don't cause you to have to go through 47 different windows to get to that little button. That tends to be available so much easier, which is what this layout gives you. So I will use this because it's easier and better suited. The other thing is that it, by default, apart from the -12 semitone, so an octave low, has drift on. If we're after a real digital experience, then digital synths didn't drift. Occasionally you could get jitter or movement in your converters, especially if they're like dropped out of a window. But the thing is, they're rigid. So nothing against the drift button. Cool that it's there, really is. But just to be aware that it's kind of analogizing a synth that's trying to be digital. So if you're sort of going, yeah, but it's sort of, then turn off drift. All right, now we have a serious hardcore digital workspace. It all works around wiring most of the time, except for some of these things that, where are they? Or some of them work around like this. They work around a drop down. So there's a little bit of inconsistency there. You get used to it, but that's part of where I feel like there are perhaps some limits. There's no doubt very logical reasons why it was done this way. Part of me would like to have a synth that's kind of like this, a whole pile of modules, and then a big mofo of a modulation matrix. Not wires, because it gets messy, but just the Reason style, the Thor Europa style modulation matrix that's, well, preferably infinite. I mean, who wants to be limited with these things? Making it a lot easier to do, but then that's another screen and it becomes all kinds of complex in its own way. So I'm not saying this is bad or wrong, but you do need to get used to the style. But when nothing's wired, nothing happens. This isn't perfectly modular, but it's getting there. So whilst it's strictly still semi-modular, it's the semi's in small letters. We take the output of something and drag it to the input. We can drag the other way round as well, but if I take this and try to put it there, like if I want to move my purple cable, it doesn't happen. So the cables are somewhat unidirectional. If I plug it to here and then I decide I don't want it there, I can take its destination end and move it. That's doable. But if I decide, no, I want it to tap here to there, then I have to grab from here to there. It takes a couple of goes to get used to, but this is an inevitability of this kind of system with the choices that have been made. After a while, you get used to it and you sort of go, well, okay, where's it coming from? Where's it going to? If I want to keep where it's coming from, but change where it's going to, then I just grab the destination end. But if I want to keep where it's going to, but change where it's coming from, then I choose the socket and repatch. There are some things that allow you to multiple out or in, and there are some things that only allow one, in which case you've got 2 jack sockets. Again, you will get used to it. There's a logic underneath it. The simple logic is if it's red, it's an output. If it's grey, it's an input. You can't route things like this. You can route that, but that's a feedback loop. I've not tried to see what would happen. Might get interesting. It's always worth having a limiter across, well, any instrument, particularly an instrument like this, where you might do something silly like routing its filter in a circle. And going, yeah. You might, if you were doing that, route it through one of the multiplexers and back out there. So that allows you to at least level control what's going on. Init, there is an init function, so you right click up in this section here and it will give you an init. If you normal click, left click, then it'll give you presets, but we ain't interested in presets of the week. That we start with that sine wave, and that is all about oscillators. This synth, Batzilla, is not really about filters. It has fine filters, don't get me wrong, but digital synthesis is far more about the oscillator than the filter. Hence, DX7s, Casio CZs, I think the Quai K series stuff, no filters. Because it was all about how we're going to make that sound from the beginning. As I say, filters are for the week. So we've got our oscillator outputting to our output, which we can control here. Double click to make it go home, and then there is a master level here. The synth is prone to running loud, so you may find at times you need to pull it back. The simple enough sorts of things. There's the ability to then fly in modulations, which we will talk to later. Oscillator. We can run across a range of 2 octaves and then move the whole synth here. Again, feels just a tiny bit limited, but so be it. Fine-tuning, we can actually change how our fine-tuning behaves. On the surface, you won't necessarily hear a difference, but then we've got this one, which is whatever our current pitching is. That bothers me slightly. That center is not in the center. But when you have real hardware, it's often the case that things are not where they're supposed to be. So that's kind of a cool thing, that we can do some kooky sorts of tuning, and they are needed later. And then we can fly in modulation from a source and decide how aggressive we can be with that, well, movement. So that's obviously pretty aggressive, not as aggressive, or... So it's nice to have those sorts of things where you can control how, like the level or the weight that can be assigned there. That's nice. Then looking at basically how it works. Before we start plugging anything in or getting complex, it's a phase distortion instrument. Phase distortion It's a bit weird, but basically what we have is a bass waveform, in this sense a cosine, which is in broad terms a sine wave. And we can distort that sine wave into a target waveform. And these are pretty accurately the Casio CZ forms. I don't want to say they're perfectly accurate because they probably aren't, but they are good enough for knife fighting. So as we distort more, you can see that we get more and more into something resembling a sawtooth. And that sounds good. As I said before, that's pleasingly Casio CZ. Let's turn that drift off again. Nice. So the CZ worked from moving that distortion with a second DCA, with a second envelope. So in simple terms, we would wire our second thing here to there. And that gives us that really nice CZ sound. Yes, it's cardboardy, but that's the nature of that beast. So phase distortion is how we get our basic sounds. We can choose different target forms. And that's, while not a perfect square, it sounds very tubular and is quite consistent actually with analog sounds. Casio, whilst designing their phase distortion, their Cosmo, which I believe was designed in part with Isao Tomita. If you don't know Tomita, you need to know Tomita. Deceased now, but you need to know his music. Just to hear how amazingly wild he was. How he used the rules to reinvent the rules. So a lot of people who had CZs, like Vince Clarke, loved them because they had all the control of digital whilst sounding quite analogy in their own cool kind of a way. Impulse, which is a super cool waveform, especially for plucked type sounds. It's kind of like the impulse form and sort of a sawtooth. Very nice, very versatile thing. Half saw. Which again is nice and versatile. And then these funny resonant waves, because remember the CZ had no filter. There was no way to do the resonance thing. But being digital, we could create. So again with the and they were capable of sounding really cool. A very digital emulation of analogy resonance. Super cool. The phase distortion then actually had a second oscillator. But unlike your sort of Juno, where you run the two of them at once, this appends it, like glues it to the second half. So if we're just running same on the second slot, both slots are running at exactly the same and you don't notice any difference. If we, however, let's say start with a saw and put a square, see, we've got a sawtooth and a square following each other, not on top of each other. They're following each other. Because they follow each other, it's quite common that they drop an octave in their perception because the wave has now become twice as long. feature of the CZ and its form. It's a sound you've got to learn to deal with and learn to love. It definitely benefits having some effects on it, but I want to show you how cool they are. But if we pair, we get really cool sounds, and you heard these sounds on records. And we were all a bit like, where'd that come from? And the Casio CZ was everywhere. If you doubt me, then a lot of early rapish, so Salt and Pepper, boop, doo 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 doo, Push It, this Casio CZ. There were rock bands. I was watching the Australian band, the Venetians. So Much for Love. And the guy's playing a Casio of some kind in that video. My guess is that it possibly was the FZ 16 or something or other. I had an early sampler. They were the first 16-bit sampler. Forget Akai. The Casio was a good bit of kit. It got re-famous with the techno people for Delight, Groove Is in the Heart. They used it, so I was like, oh, well, now we're allowed to use it. But the FZ was a good bit of kit. Never had one, but they were a good bit of kit. So really lovely oscillator with a lot of flexibility in what you can do with it. Now, remember, it works from a cosine, but you can actually move its core form. So if we take our core form, oh, better turn that down. It's a sine because we've said, well, it's a cosine, but we'll call it a sine. You can then have these things called tap maps. What on earth is a tap map? And this is where I had to look at the manual. They're actually the mapping generators. So you can use these mapping generators, which we'll cover a little bit more later, and get, say, a... That'll do. See, that is that. Brilliant. Now we can phase distort that. Some sounds will be more dramatic than others. See, we get something that's a different kind of square. And once you start getting your head around how that works, then you start to realize I can make all kinds of cool sounds from this. So it's possible to use that map, say where you draw your own oscillator waveform purely on its own, or to phase distort it, therefore CZ-ifying it. So you can use either of these as your root, which you then distort. Super, super cool. Will take you a little bit to get your head around it, but the more you play with it, the more you'll go, I see now. But very simply, you've got your core form, which is, in this case, we'll loosely call a sine wave, which you can distort up to a saw form, or we can choose whatever form we've made here, and we'll get into that later, which we can then distort using saw, square, impulse, what have you. There's a lot of fun to be had in that. They also have this thing called fractalizer. And we'll come back to the FM, don't freak out. It's off to start with because it always impacts. See, as soon as we turn that on, we don't really have our original waveform anymore. This is similar-ish to sync, to oscillator sync. So it's a kind of multiplying by itself. Another variant on the loosish concepts that we think of as FM and phase distortion. So you will tend to get that resonant-y sort of sound. And they give you a couple of different forms. And there's a lot of beautiful sounds to be had in there once you work out how you want to control that through time. So if we just simply use what we already had. There's a lot of change, so there is fun to be had because we can obviously modulate that as well. Cool stuff. The other thing that we can do is PM, phase modulation, which you know as Yamaha DX. So we can take our other oscillator and feed it in here. This then becomes relevant. So phase modulation, fine, medium, coarse, and some various other options. If we go back to saw and same and fall back to that sine, making sure that our fractalizer's off. We've got FM. Now at this point we might consider moving from semitones to overtones. Took me a little bit to work out what that really meant, but the tuning series on the DX7 style of FM is not just based on semitones, it's based on harmonics. So your first overtone is an octave, the second one I think is an octave, and then it becomes 7 semitones, and then it becomes 3, and they get closer as you go up. But if you're looking for that DX70 sort of sound, it's there. If we take our output from our second envelope here, we get that. But our overtone can cause a different sound or feel. That's turning it into an LFO. To be honest, I didn't read what clocked was. You're just going to want to read it, basically. This doesn't always behave the same as a DX7. If you want a DX7 clone, I'm not recommending this as that, but the more you understand how the system is working, the easier it is to do those sorts of things. They're your main functions of the oscillators. You have 4 of these oscillators, they're all the same, and naturally you can start flying them in to do things to each other. Cool. It is easy to get nasty noises. Down here, horrid, pretty useless. Up here, quite charming. So if we add in a little bit of delay and reverb. Cool. Delay's far too long. That's easier to work with. So cool stuff to be had there. If we liked that sound, but then felt like, I need to back that down a little bit, we can put it into our filter. And then you've got to wire it. So into the filter, out of the filter. You need to be aware of what you're doing. It will get blippy with high resonance. We might use another envelope here. It's very eager to go into self-oscillation, so you can do self-oscillation, or if you want to avoid the self-oscillation, then you can turn the gain right up, and it'll force it out. If you want a different output, let's say a 12, remember we've got a drag from the 12 to here. They are a nice filter. They seem to be built around an analog-ish kind of model, but they don't necessarily sound the same as a straight analog emulation, maybe in part because the digital oscillator tends to, especially once you have fun, feed them a somewhat different form, so the way they behave is naturally different. Or the results that we hear are naturally different. And that's really cool. While we could say, okay, we'll get something like that out of an analog type synth, there's a rawness to this that is really super cool and doesn't come as easily out of your, well, to stay in the UHI universe, out of your Hive Zebra kind of thing. So if you're using those traditional kind of synths like Europa here, it doesn't really deliver this. You can make things that sound like this, but they won't quite have that rawness to them. Obviously, turning on drift softens some of that, if that's a thing you're going with, but this is a digital environment. So the filters, we can obviously set up all the usual stuff, cut-off resonance, key following, and then assign modulations to things. I'm going to assume that you can get your head around that fairly easily. There are actually 4 of these filters. 3 and 4 are a little less fully featured than 1 and 2, but they're all there. Let's undo some of this wiring, go back to being a proper digital synth. And at the moment, the only output is to the FM, but there's nothing to stop us in many situations from having several outputs to different destinations. If we wanted that, otherwise we could actually tap from here, but bear in mind we lose our amp envelope in that process. It's good that we are given the option to tap pre and post envelope. If you're going, yeah, but I want both, then you would be moving out to a multiplex, which we'll look at in a moment. Now, there's another feature, which is really more of an oscillator feature. We've got this stacking mode. At the moment, we've got 8 voices allowed. Let's run up to 16. If we say 2, okay, we've now suddenly got louder. And then the stack voice tuning. If I say 3 voices, Now I'm probably going to need to use my fine tuning, so it's Shift. Hello. This belongs more at the oscillator because digital synthesis is mostly about the oscillator, so we can stack how our oscillators play back. In this case, we've got one perfectly tuned, one an octave up, and one a smidge high. So now our single key is actually swallowing 3 voices. Let's give ourselves one more, which means that 16 voices, we've got a four voice synth. And what are we going to do with this last one? Why not just drop an octave, but tune it ever so slightly high. We are losing some notes because we don't have a ton of them. But playing jarre chords, 2 notes, we've got plenty of voices and a really nice, rich, dramatic sort of a sound. So your stack voice has got a couple of functions, some of which I did not get my head around at all, didn't read the manual on them, but your stack voice can be used like a normal unison if you're just doing fine detuning, but really it's not meant for that. It's meant for doing cool things. Oh, that's a bit ELO. That's a really, really nice feature. Different, but a nice feature. So that's our single voice, but we were playing plus the offset voice. So really very interesting feature when you take the time and get your head around how to set it up. It's more time consuming, but everything about this process will be more time consuming. Remember, it's for those who want to do things this way. If we unplug that, remember, it's got its own volume envelope. Let's slow that right down. So go back here. It would be nice to have easier ways sometimes to manage. I guess we can just drop the level here. Or we could decide to route these to the old might have gotten a bit quiet. Everything's loud in the cans, especially with piercing sounds like this. We're getting really nice movement. Turn the phaser off there. Cool. So that's our oscillators, our filters, our stack. The envelopes we've looked at already, they're really a standard ADSR, but there are a couple of quirks. We can modify the rate of our envelope. So at the moment that one's running a bit slow. I have to choose a source. That one kind of annoys me. It's inconsistent. So we have to modulate that by mod wheel. So as I raise my mod wheel, everything about that envelope just compresses in time. So we can use, let's say, an LFO 2. That will do the job. And we don't want that to be gate, we want that to be single. And some key presses, the whole envelope's moving faster, some it's moving slower. It's easier to see and hear in certain situations. But if you want your sounds to seem a little less static, nice for clarinet, oboe, fluty kinds of sounds, where you want some kind of movement, but you don't necessarily want to be controlling it all yourself, then you could set an LFO or some other velocity or some other sort of parameter to change how the thing flows. And while you don't consciously understand it, at that point, the modulation, as I'm moving across notes, changes the sound. Hear how that's very sort of even, none of the notes are appearing. Your listener won't hear the difference consciously. They won't say, oh, that's what they're doing, but they'll just go, that's a really intriguing sound. It's always moving around. So that's a nice feature of this. You can modulate the output by certain things. So we could, let's go with the same envelope 2. Oh, sorry, LFO 2. Creating a tremolo, altering whatever is happening, and we can change where this is triggered by. So we can trigger this by an LFO. Which gets complex. You got to kind of know what's going on here, and as you've seen, we can output the envelopes activity and send it somewhere else. So rather cool. Need to take your time to understand how it works and how it works in this particular instrument, and then you'll go, ooh, now that's cool. The more time you spend in an environment like this, the better. Now you may have seen this multiplexer. Let's just try to undo some of the weirdness so that we've got a fairly normal kind of an output here. Get rid of that. Now let's say I take a random LFO here and put it here, and I want it to adjust. Actually, no, we'll put this back through the filter. It's the easiest thing to adjust and get very obvious results for. So let's say I've wired that directly like this, and I'm going, yeah, look, that's cool, but it's just too much. I then use a multiplexer, wire it through the multiplexer, and I can turn the level down. It's one of several things that we can do with the multiplexers. We can even modulate using something else. Let's say we modulate using this. So I'm a little unclear on what affects what at the moment, to be very honest. Okay, that's accepting both the envelope and the... we would need another to do the modulation. Again, like I said, I'm not going to cover every feature, but the multiplex allows you to do what's essentially mathematical operations upon signals. Anyone who's used to this sort of stuff will understand how they work. There are a few other things that are similar. Let's say with our random LFO, if we go, it's too choppy chippy. I don't want it to sound that way. Then we can put it through a lag generator. Yes, I know this has the ability to change it on board. Okay, we've gone with the choppy chippy. That's smoothing out. So it's essentially a CV filter. It's a filter you can put in the middle of a CV. There is nothing to stop us from actually using a filter here as well, I should imagine, at least in theory. Actually, let's just test that. Let's whack this into filter 2 and that to there. So we've got our LFO going to here. There we go. So a lag generator is a lot like a filter, that you just mostly use it to smooth an input at. No doubt there are various other things you can do because we've got our attack and release here, so it behaves a little differently from a filter, but that's what a lag generator does. There's also this sequence here. Let's just undo this and try and keep our wiring as simple as possible. We can take an output from this sequencer. But there are also ways to take this output from other points. So it's only using the first 4, even though the sequence is running all the way through to 16. So we can take that there and I don't know, let's go with tuning for this second one. So we can hear that second oscillator jumping. And that's how we get all kinds of interesting sorts of movement, because what's happening here is only taking that bit, whereas the other one's taking the whole bit, and so they will offset against each other. I'm not 100% sure what that number did. Again, need to RTFM. It's a fancier feature. Obviously, it's going to have its function, so we can set up how this works. An interesting thing is that we've got different and it's possible to morph between them. So if you watch these, that's 100% that. It's now a bit of both until it's 100% that. Therefore, being a bit of both, or using an LFO to modulate between the two, or using a velocity value to modulate between the two, anything like that means that our thing that seems a bit static here can become all kinds of interesting. So we've got access to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, looks like 7 or 8 different slots, and there are different ways that they can be controlled as well. Division merely means we divide the clock by either exactly what it is or we speed it up. So 2 would be we're now running at twice the clock speed. Clock divide, clock DVA, being the band who took their name from that. Sequencer, or there are the ramp modules, which are kind of a simplified ADSR, kind of. There's the other LFO and what have you. We've got some glide modes, usual kinds of stuff. Mapping generators, obviously, we can get in and use as a modulation source, but I'm not really going to talk about that. You saw that we can draw them by hand. We can come in and draw them by hand here, and then various different functions to handle what goes on, as well as some preset shapes, all that kind of stuff. And then effects. We have a distortion, a delay, a phaser, and a spring reverb. As you might have noticed, we can rearrange them. They're not the strongest part of the synth, but they don't do more than they say they're going to do. They don't pretend to do more than they say they're going to do. And so I think they're pretty well chosen. They may not be your solution all the time, but they can work quite nicely. So we can add a few different types of nasty. Thankfully, most of the preference is not on horrid nasty. It's on sort of what we might call good nasty, with the exception of things like rectifiers, which are, well, nasty. And we can really quite change our results. So we can fairly easily transition just with drift and using a tube style distortion and some tilts to giving ourselves a very moody sort of a sound. That's cool. We've got the delay. Actually, we'll do the phaser next, which is run as a sort of a flangery type mode. Or small stone mode, which is the classic Jarre stomp pedal kind of thing. It can be really nice, or it can just not quite work out, in which case go off board. Delay, I find a little complicated, but we've got center settings and side settings, and they're somewhat separate from each other, which in its own way is probably kind of cool. If we pull out the dry, they seem to be all preset, probably to 16ths. So you can have centers and sides and what have you, compared to our off, on. Not the most thorough delay ever. And possibly slightly frustrating that it doesn't, there's space, but it doesn't have a wobbly knobbly. But there are so many other options, including wobbly delays coming from UHI as well. So it's consistent with a digital instrument, even though we've got these sort of analogy kinds of options as well. And then reverb. You don't seem to be able to automate that, which is a shame because I wanted to automate it in my piece at least once to knock the box. That basically just changes our sort of center frequency. It's not really an everything reverb, but it does add a nice sort of bit of thing. Again, there's a little bit of a sense of discrepancy. It was like, hang on, was this a Moog modular? Is this sort of 1971, or is this 1985 or 6 or 8 or whatever? In which case, we wouldn't have a spring reverb. We'd have a digital reverb. But again, it's an onboard. I understand his logic in going this way because it's such a digital sounding synth that it can be very digital and flat and cardboardy and all those things that people say are terrible about digital synths. So adding these analogy kinds of things afterwards, yes, it was quite common that, you know, you had your Fairlight and it came out of a Fairlight and it might have gone into a Space Echo. So there's nothing wrong with them being there. It just is, it's so much the device is going in this direction and then it says, oh, but you really want to go in that direction as well. And part of me sort of thinks, yeah, keep them there, or why don't you just offer this and make this such a digital paradise, which you've sort of largely done, and give us these digital effects as well. But I know that most people are going to want this sound because this does sound really good. But it doesn't sound digital synth anymore. If we were to take that sound and well, let's go with where is it? There. I've probably got these the wrong way around. Let's multiplicate first. But again, we can very easily raise the argument to say, oh, but that's just basically the same thing. But I feel like we're keeping more of the nature of the digital instrument, which we're then feeding into these. But that comes to personal preference. Obviously, I have a fair personal preference towards these wee fellas because, well, I made them and this is the kind of sound I like to hear. That really covers everything. We've gone, how have we gone? An hour and a quarter, that's long enough. So my final words really are, it is, as I've said, a digital paradise and most of the way to being an absolute digital powerhouse. There are some decisions which become limiting that, as I always say, most likely hold a real logic. And they do define how the instrument sounds and behaves ultimately. But sometimes I've just sort of gone, but. Fair enough. Such is the nature of said beast. You are very much going to need to the FM. If you don't read the manual, you will miss things about this because there are decisions made and things like this tap map actually being the mapping generator. Why it's called a tap map rather than that, or maybe it means let's tap out of map 1. But it's there in the manual, and it's consistent and easy enough when you know what you're doing. In terms of what you can do with it, it's not going to immediately sound like Hive or Zebra. It doesn't immediately sound like Europa. But therein lies its real charm, in that it's got this really dedicated digital sound. And particularly if you apply your own chosen effects afterwards, as you see here. We can get sounds that, at least for us, are going to be truly beautiful, and far more likely our own sound than just another Hive or Dune or whatever preset. Unless, of course, you're like that fellow who wants clones of all so-and-so's preset from his latest bangin' tune so that you can clone that. And, okay, fair enough, your business, but is that really going to get you recognition, or are people going to go, you know, it kind of sounds like that hit, but I'll go listen to that song because that's the original one. Like people who try to sound too much like Metallica or Nirvana or Taylor Swift or Ed Sheepman or whatever, you guarantee that people are going to go, oh, reminds me of, and they go off and listen to the original because it's always going to be the best. If you have questions, not about Uhi or how to pronounce his name or how to support his software, that's for him. I'm sure he's probably got an FAQ somewhere on how to pronounce his name, so we can be good and right about that, and Germanic. But just generally about, well, the content of this video. Watch it. If there's a thing you don't understand, ask the question. Hey, when you said this, that's the kind of stuff we like. And of course, hit subscribe. And don't forget, over at higherhertz.com, as is on my... give up, this is too hard. On my shirt, you can pick up the Hertz Delay and Multiplier plugins. Delay having been out for some time, Multiplier being the new one. There we go, now it's all on screen. They got their own videos and explained and what have you. I'd love to see some stuff come back from some users saying, here, we've used Delay and Multiplier a lot in this situation. Obviously, we love to hear what has been done with these to see how people are using them. Might even give us ideas for what we might make next for you. That's enough from me. Type below, hit subscribe, and have a good day.